She paid $18,000 for a crumbling brewery that hadn't produced a single drop of beer in 23 years. The windows were boarded up, the copper tanks green with oxidation, and the locals in Millfield, Oregon whispered she'd thrown her inheritance away on a monument to failure. But deep in the forgotten cellars of Cascade Falls Brewing Company, sealed behind walls that time had forgotten, Maya Rodriguez would discover barrels containing something far more valuable than any craft beer. What she found fermenting in the darkness would not only change her life forever, but rewrite the history of American prohibition and uncover one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What started as a desperate attempt to save her family's legacy would become a battle to preserve a piece of American history that powerful forces wanted to remain buried. But before we dive into Maya's incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our global community. The morning Maya Rodriguez signed the papers for Cascade Falls Brewing Company, the sky over Millfield, Oregon hung gray and heavy, as if the clouds themselves disapproved of her decision. At 31, Maya had the weathered hands of someone who'd spent her life working with her grandfather in his small-town restaurant, Casa Rodriguez, learning to fix everything from temperamental ovens to stubborn plumbing. But those same hands now trembled slightly as she gripped the pen that would either save her future or destroy it completely. The brewery had been abandoned since 1999, when the last owner, a dreamer named Thomas Kellerman, had walked away after his craft beer venture collapsed under mounting debt and fierce competition from larger breweries moving into the Pacific Northwest. For over 2 decades, the massive brick building had stood like a tomb at the edge of town, its towering silos and sprawling complex a constant reminder of ambition gone wrong. Weeds pushed through cracks in the loading dock concrete. Windows stared blindly from behind sheets of plywood. The iconic Cascade Falls Brewing sign, once proudly displayed above the main entrance, hung at a dejected angle, half the letters missing. Maya had driven past this place countless times growing up, always wondering what stories lived inside those silent walls. As a child, her grandfather would slow the car when they passed, pointing at the building with a mixture of sadness and respect. "Mira, Maya," he would say in his gentle accent. "That place, it had dreams once, big dreams. Sometimes the biggest dreams need the longest time to come true." Those words echoed in her mind now as she stood in the real estate office, surrounded by papers that would transfer ownership of nearly 40,000 square feet of industrial space, including the main brewing facility, administrative offices, a tasting room that had never opened to the public, and most importantly, the extensive cellar system that had been carved into the hillside behind the main building. The asking price was $18,000, barely more than a used car, which should have been her first warning that this was either the deal of a lifetime or a financial death sentence. But Maya wasn't thinking about warnings. She was thinking about her grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, who had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving her not just the restaurant, but also a handwritten letter that had changed everything. In careful Spanish cursive, he had told her about his own father, her great-grandfather, Eduardo, who had come to Oregon in 1932 during the final years of Prohibition. Eduardo had been more than just an immigrant seeking a better life. He had been carrying something precious, something he'd hidden somewhere in Millfield before disappearing into family legend. "The treasure isn't gold, mija," he wrote. "It's history. It's proof of who we are, where we came from, and why it matters. I searched for 40 years but never found where Eduardo hid it. Maybe you will have better luck. Maybe you will know where to look." The letter included a faded photograph of Eduardo standing beside what looked like large wooden barrels, and in the background, though partially obscured, Maya could make out the distinctive brick architecture that she now recognized as Cascade Falls Brewing Company. The building had existed long before Thomas Kellerman's failed craft beer venture. It had originally been constructed in 1928 as the Millfield Industrial Complex, housing everything from grain storage to small manufacturing operations during the early decades of the century. Maya had spent weeks researching, diving into property records, old newspaper archives, and immigration documents at the county courthouse. What she discovered painted a picture of her great-grandfather as a man who had arrived in Oregon carrying more than just hopes for a new life. Eduardo Rodriguez had been what they called a guardian during Prohibition, someone entrusted with preserving and protecting valuable items during the chaos and uncertainty of the era. The documents were fragmentary and often contradictory, but they suggested Eduardo had been part of a network of people who helped safeguard not just alcohol, but cultural artifacts, important documents, and valuable items belonging to families who feared persecution or deportation. The more Maya learned, the more convinced she became that her great-grandfather had hidden something significant somewhere in what is now the abandoned brewery. But convincing herself was one thing. Convincing everyone else in her life was proving impossible. She paid $18,000 for a crumbling brewery that hadn't produced a single drop of beer in 23 years. The windows were boarded up, the copper tanks green with oxidation, and the locals in Millfield, Oregon whispered she'd thrown her inheritance away on a monument to failure. But deep in the forgotten cellars of Cascade Falls Brewing Company, sealed behind walls that time had forgotten, Maya Rodriguez would discover barrels containing something far more valuable than any craft beer. What she found fermenting in the darkness would not only change her life forever, but rewrite the history of American Prohibition and uncover one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What started as a desperate attempt to save her family's legacy would become a battle to preserve a piece of American history that powerful forces wanted to remain buried. But before we dive into Maya's incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our global community. The morning Maya Rodriguez signed the papers for Cascade Falls Brewing Company, the sky over Millfield, Oregon hung gray and heavy, as if the clouds themselves disapproved of her decision. At 31, Maya had the weathered hands of someone who'd spent her life working with her grandfather in his small-town restaurant, Casa Rodriguez, learning to fix everything from temperamental ovens to stubborn plumbing. But those same hands now trembled slightly as she gripped the pen that would either save her future or destroy it completely. The brewery had been abandoned since 1999, when the last owner, a dreamer named Thomas Kellerman, had walked away after his craft beer venture collapsed under mounting debt and fierce competition from larger breweries moving into the Pacific Northwest. For over 2 decades, the massive brick building had stood like a tomb at the edge of town, its towering silos and sprawling complex a constant reminder of ambition gone wrong. Weeds pushed through cracks in the loading dock concrete. Windows stared blindly from behind sheets of plywood. The iconic Cascade Falls Brewing sign, once proudly displayed above the main entrance, hung at a dejected angle, half the letters missing. Maya had driven past this place countless times growing up, always wondering what stories lived inside those silent walls. As a child, her grandfather would slow the car when they passed, pointing at the building with a mixture of sadness and respect. "Mira, Maya," he would say in his gentle accent. "That place, it had dreams once. Big dreams. Sometimes the biggest dreams need the longest time to come true." Those words echoed in her mind now as she stood in the real estate office, surrounded by papers that would transfer ownership of nearly 40,000 square feet of industrial space, including the main brewing facility, administrative offices, a tasting room that had never opened to the public, and most importantly, the extensive cellar system that had been carved into the hillside behind the main building. The asking price was $18,000, barely more than a used car, which should have been her first warning that this was either the deal of a lifetime or a financial death sentence. But Maya wasn't thinking about warnings. She was thinking about her grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, who had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving her not just the restaurant, but also a handwritten letter that had changed everything. In careful Spanish cursive, he had told her about his own father, her great-grandfather, Eduardo, who had come to Oregon in 1932 during the final years of Prohibition. Eduardo had been more than just an immigrant seeking a better life. He had been carrying something precious, something he'd hidden somewhere in Millfield before disappearing into family legend. "The treasure isn't gold, mija," he had written. "It's history. It's proof of who we are, where we came from, and why it matters. I searched for 40 years but never found where Eduardo hid it. Maybe you will have better luck. Maybe you will know where to look." The letter included a faded photograph of Eduardo standing beside what looked like large wooden barrels, and in the background, though partially obscured, Maya could make out the distinctive brick architecture that she now recognized as Cascade Falls Brewing Company. The building had existed long before Thomas Kellerman's failed craft beer venture. It had originally been constructed in 1928 as the Millfield Industrial Complex, housing everything from grain storage to small manufacturing operations during the early decades of the century. Maya had spent weeks researching, diving into property records, old newspaper archives, and immigration documents at the county courthouse. What she discovered painted a picture of her great-grandfather as a man who had arrived in Oregon carrying more than just hopes for a new life. Eduardo Rodriguez had been what they called a guardian during Prohibition, someone entrusted with preserving and protecting valuable items during the chaos and uncertainty of the era. The documents were fragmentary and often contradictory, but they suggested Eduardo had been part of a network of people who helped safeguard not just alcohol, but cultural artifacts, important documents, and valuable items belonging to families who feared persecution or deportation. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that her great-grandfather had hidden something significant somewhere in what was now the abandoned brewery. But convincing herself was one thing. Convincing everyone else in her life was proving impossible. Her mother, Carmen Rodriguez, had been devastated when Maya announced her plan. "You're throwing away everything your grandfather built," she had said, tears streaming down her face as they stood in the empty dining room of Casa Rodriguez. "The restaurant is struggling. We barely make rent each month, and you want to spend our only savings on a building that's been rotting for 20 years? Maya, please think about what you're doing." Her younger brother, David, had been even more direct. "You're chasing ghosts, Maya. Great-grandfather Eduardo? We don't even know if half those stories are true. And even if they are, what makes you think there's anything left to find after all this time? You're going to lose everything chasing a fantasy." Even her closest friend, Jessica Chen, who had supported Maya through every difficult decision in her life, had expressed serious doubts. "I love that you want to honor your family's history," Jessica had said during one of their late-night conversations in the restaurant's kitchen. "But Maya, you're talking about risking your entire inheritance on a hunch. What if you're wrong? What if there's nothing there? You could lose the restaurant, lose your home, lose everything your family worked for." But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to take this risk. It wasn't just about the potential discovery. It was about honoring the courage her great-grandfather had shown when he came to America with nothing but determination and a secret mission. It was about proving that sometimes the biggest leaps of faith lead to the most extraordinary destinations. The real estate agent, a tired-looking man named Bob Hartwell, who clearly thought Maya was making a massive mistake, had warned her repeatedly about the condition of the property. "Look, Ms. Rodriguez, I'm legally obligated to tell you that this building has been sitting empty for over 20 years. There's extensive water damage, the electrical system is completely outdated, and we've had reports of structural issues in some of the older sections. The city has been talking about condemning it for years. You sure you don't want to look at some nice residential properties instead?
I've got a lovely little cottage just outside town that would be perfect for a young woman like yourself." Maya had politely but firmly declined. She didn't want a cottage. She wanted answers. She wanted to finish what Eduardo Rodriguez had started nearly a century ago. The day she took ownership, Maya drove to the brewery alone, parked outside the main entrance, and sat in her truck for almost an hour, staring at the building that now belonged to her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown parking lot, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of Cascade Creek, the small waterway that had given the brewery its name and had once provided the pure mountain water that made the location so attractive to brewers. When she finally gathered the courage to step out of the truck, the first thing that struck her was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the heavy, waiting silence of a place that had been holding its breath for decades. The main door was secured with a heavy chain and multiple padlocks, but Bob Hartwell had given her all the keys, along with a flashlight and a cell phone number to call when you come to your senses and want to sell this place back to the city for demolition. The locks opened with surprising ease, as if they had been waiting for her. The chain fell away with a metallic clatter that echoed off the empty buildings around her, and Maya pushed open the heavy wooden door for the first time in over 20 years. The smell hit her immediately, not the musty, moldy odor she had expected, but something else entirely. There was dampness, yes, and the scent of old wood and metal, but underneath it all was something almost sweet, like yeast and grain and time itself. It was the ghost of what this place had once been, still lingering in the air after all these years of abandonment. Maya stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a vast open space that once had been the main brewing floor. Massive copper tanks, green with patina but still magnificent, rose like monuments to industrial ambition. Pipes and valves created an intricate maze overhead, and along the walls she could see the remnants of what had been a sophisticated operation: gauges, control panels, and equipment that spoke of serious brewing expertise. But it was the silence that struck her most powerfully. This place had once hummed with activity, filled with the sounds of production, the voices of workers, the mechanical symphony of a functioning brewery. Now it was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat, her own breathing, the soft echo of her footsteps on the concrete floor. As she explored deeper into the building, Maya began to understand the full scope of what she had purchased. The main brewing floor was just the beginning. There were offices upstairs, their windows still covered with plywood, but their interiors surprisingly well preserved. There was a laboratory where recipes had been tested and perfected, still equipped with scales and measuring devices. There was a shipping area with loading docks that once sent trucks full of beer throughout the region. And then, behind a door marked cellar access, Maya found the stairs that led down into the hillside, into the underground storage areas where beer had once been aged and stored at perfect temperatures year-round. These weren't just basement rooms. They were extensive tunnels and chambers carved directly into the rock, creating a naturally cool environment that had made this location so valuable to brewers. As she descended the stone steps, her flashlight illuminating rough-hewn walls and arched ceilings, Maya felt like she was traveling backward through time. The air grew cooler with each step, and the sweet, yeasty smell grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, her light revealed a network of passages and rooms, some large enough to hold dozens of barrels, others smaller and more intimate.
And there, in the largest chamber, Maya saw them for the first time. Hundreds of wooden barrels, stacked in careful rows, covered with decades of dust, but somehow still intact. Her heart raced as she approached the nearest barrel, running her hand along its curved surface, feeling the solid wood beneath the grime. These weren't the plastic or metal containers she had expected to find in a modern brewery. These were old-fashioned wooden barrels, the kind that would have been used for aging beer or wine decades ago. Some bore faded markings in languages she couldn't immediately identify. Others had numbers or symbols carved into their surfaces, and all of them seemed to be sealed, as if they had been waiting patiently in the darkness for someone to discover their secrets. Maya stood alone in that underground chamber, surrounded by mysteries that had been hidden for longer than she had been alive, and realized that her real adventure was just beginning. Whatever Eduardo Rodriguez had left behind, whatever secrets these barrels contained, she was now the only person who could uncover the truth. But as she prepared to examine the barrels more closely, a sound from somewhere deeper in the tunnels made her freeze. A soft scraping noise, as if something or someone else was moving through the darkness. Maya gripped her flashlight tighter and listened, her heart pounding, wondering if she was truly alone in this forgotten place, or if the secrets of Cascade Falls Brewing Company were guarded by more than just time and silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the scraping sound echoed through the underground chambers again, closer this time. She pressed herself against the nearest barrel, flashlight clutched in her trembling hand, and forced herself to think rationally. Old buildings make noise, pipes settle, small animals find their way into abandoned places. But as the sound came a third time, deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps on stone, Maya knew she wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, leaving only silence in return. She waited, counting her heartbeats, before calling out again, louder this time. "Is someone there?" The response came not as a voice, but as a beam of light that suddenly cut through the darkness from one of the side passages. Maya squinted, raising her own flashlight toward the approaching figure, and felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment wash over her as she recognized the weathered face of Frank Morrison, Millfield's longtime caretaker and informal historian. "Sorry to startle you, Maya. Saw your truck outside and figured I'd better check things out. Been keeping an eye on this place for years, making sure kids don't get themselves into trouble down here." Maya lowered her flashlight, her heart still racing. "Frank, you nearly gave me a heart attack. How did you even get in?" The older man chuckled, gesturing toward a passage Maya hadn't noticed. "Back entrance through the old service tunnel. Used to deliver ice that way back when this place was actually running. Bob Hartwell probably forgot to mention that entrance when he handed over the keys." Frank Morrison was one of those people who seemed to have been part of Millfield forever. In his 70s now, he had worked at various jobs around town: maintenance supervisor at the high school, volunteer firefighter, part-time security guard. But his real passion was local history. Maya had known him since she was a child, and he had always been full of stories about the old days, the families who had built the town, and the secrets that small communities tend to accumulate over decades. "So, you really went through with it. Bought yourself a piece of history, even if it is the kind that most folks would rather forget." "What do you mean?" Maya asked, moving closer to one of the larger barrels. In the combined light of their flashlights, she could see that some of the markings were clearer than she had first thought. Numbers, dates, and what looked like initials carved into the wood. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying the barrels with an expression Maya couldn't quite read. "Your grandfather ever tell you much about this place? About what it was before Tom Kellerman tried to turn it into a brewery?" "He mentioned it was some kind of industrial complex, built in the 20s, I think." "That's right, but that's not the whole story." Frank moved to one of the barrels, running his hand along its surface much as Maya had done. "See, during Prohibition, places like this served more than one purpose. Officially, this was Millfield Grain Storage and Processing. They took in wheat and barley from farms throughout the region and processed it and shipped it out to bigger cities. Completely legal, completely legitimate." He paused, his flashlight beam settling on a barrel that bore particularly elaborate markings. "But unofficially, well, Let's just say there were people in this area who understood that prohibition wasn't going to last forever, and they wanted to be ready when it ended. This place had the perfect setup: legitimate businesses cover, excellent storage conditions, and most importantly, a network of tunnels that connected to other buildings around town. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Are you saying this was part of some kind of bootlegging operation?
I'm saying, Frank replied carefully, that there were a lot of people during those years who found creative ways to preserve things that they believed would be valuable again someday. Not just alcohol, though that was certainly part of it. Documents, family heirlooms, even artwork that people wanted to keep safe during uncertain times. He gestured toward the rows of barrels stretching back into the darkness. Your great-grandfather, Eduardo, he wasn't just any immigrant who came to Oregon looking for work. From what I've been able to piece together over the years, he was part of a network of people who helped preserve cultural artifacts during Prohibition, sort of like an underground preservation society. Maya's pulse quickened. You knew about Eduardo? Knew of him. There are records if you know where to look. Immigration documents, employment records, even some old photographs in the Historical Society archives. Eduardo Rodriguez worked here, officially as a grain handler. But based on some documents I've found over the years, he was also involved in something much more significant. Frank led Maya deeper into the chamber, their flashlights revealing the true scope of the barrel storage area. There were hundreds of them, organized in careful rows and sections, each marked with codes that seemed to follow some kind of system. Some barrels were larger, others smaller. Some bore dates from the 1920s and 1930s, while others seemed much older. The thing is, Frank continued, when Prohibition ended in 1933, a lot of the people involved in these preservation networks just disappeared. Some moved away, some died, some decided it was safer to leave the past buried. Eduardo was one of the ones who disappeared. One day he was working here, living in a boarding house downtown, sending money back to family in Mexico. The next day, he was gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye to the people he worked with, just gone. Maya stopped in front of a particularly large barrel, one that bore Eduardo's initials, E.R., carved deeply into the wood, alongside a date, 1932. Her hands shook as she traced the letters with her fingertip. "Frank, do you think—" she began, then stopped, afraid to voice the possibility that was growing in her mind. "Do I think he left something behind? Something hidden in these barrels?" Frank nodded slowly. "Maya, I've been wondering about that for 30 years, but I never had the right to find out. This is private property, and even when it was abandoned, it didn't belong to me." He gestured toward the rows of barrels. "But it belongs to you now, and if there's anyone who has the right to uncover Eduardo Rodriguez's secrets, it's his great-granddaughter." Maya approached the barrel bearing Eduardo's initials, her flashlight revealing details she hadn't noticed before. Unlike many of the other barrels, this one showed signs of having been opened and resealed multiple times. The top was secured not just with the traditional barrel head, but with additional metal bands that looked like they had been added later. And there, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small symbol carved into the wood near the base, a distinctive mark that Maya recognized from her grandfather's old papers. "Frank," she said, her voice barely audible, "I think we need to open this one." Frank nodded and disappeared back toward the entrance, returning a few minutes later with a toolbox that he had apparently left near the service tunnel. "Been carrying these around for years just in case," he said with a slight smile. "Amazing how often you need basic tools in a place like this." Together, they worked to remove the metal bands and carefully pry open the barrel head. The wood was old but well preserved, and with patience and the right leverage, it began to give way. Maya held her breath as Frank lifted the top section away, revealing the dark interior of the barrel. The smell that emerged was unlike anything Maya had expected. It wasn't the sharp scent of alcohol or the musty odor of decay.
Instead, it was sweet and complex, with hints of vanilla, oak, and something else, something that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen during the holidays, rich and warm and full of promise. Frank handed Maya his more powerful flashlight, and she directed the beam into the interior of the barrel. What she saw made her gasp. The barrel wasn't filled with liquid as she had expected. Instead, it contained layers of carefully wrapped packages, each one sealed in what looked like oiled cloth and wax paper. The packages were various sizes, some small enough to fit in her palm, others large enough to require both hands to lift. And between the packages, filling the spaces and providing cushioning, was what appeared to be dried corn silk and grain husks, natural materials that would absorb moisture and protect the contents. Maya reached for the nearest package, a medium-sized bundle that felt surprisingly heavy for its size. The wrapping was intact, the seals unbroken. With trembling fingers, she began to carefully unfold the layers of protection. Inside was a wooden box, dark with age but beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings along its edges. Maya lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of something substantial inside. The box was secured with a simple metal clasp, which opened easily despite its age. What she found inside made both her and Frank draw sharp breaths. Nestled in faded velvet were dozens of gold coins, each one bearing markings that indicated they were Mexican pesos from the early 1900s. But these weren't ordinary coins. They were pristine, uncirculated, and some bore dates that Maya knew would make them extremely valuable to collectors. More importantly, they represented something her great-grandfather had risked everything to preserve. "Maya," Frank whispered, "these aren't just coins. They're history. They're proof of wealth and success that Eduardo was protecting for someone, maybe for his own family's future." But the coins were just the beginning. As they opened more packages from the barrel, Maya discovered items that painted a picture of Eduardo Rodriguez as more than just an immigrant worker. There were documents written in Spanish, contracts and agreements that suggested Eduardo had been involved in legitimate business dealings that spanned both sides of the border. There were photographs of families, some wearing formal clothing that suggested wealth and status. There were pieces of jewelry, not ostentatious, but clearly valuable and crafted with skill. And then, in one of the largest packages, Maya found something that changed everything. It was a leather-bound ledger, thick and heavy, filled with detailed records written in Eduardo's careful handwriting. The entries were in both Spanish and English, and they documented something extraordinary: a systematic effort to preserve valuable items belonging to Mexican families who'd been displaced during the political upheavals of the 1910s and 1920s. According to the ledger, Eduardo hadn't been acting alone. He had been part of a network that stretched across the American Southwest, helping families preserve their wealth and cultural artifacts during a period when being Mexican in America could mean losing everything you had worked for. The network had safe houses, secure storage locations, and trusted individuals who could move items across state lines when necessary. The Cascade Falls location had been chosen specifically because of its remote location, its legitimate business cover, and its natural storage conditions. Eduardo had been the guardian of items belonging to dozens of families, carefully cataloging everything and maintaining detailed records of who owned what. "Frank," Maya said, her voice filled with awe as she turned the pages of the ledger, "this isn't just my family's treasure. This belongs to families all over the Southwest. Eduardo was protecting other people's heritage." Frank leaned over her shoulder, studying the careful entries. "And if this ledger is accurate, there are probably dozens more barrels here, each one containing items belonging to different families. Maya, you haven't just inherited a building, you've inherited the responsibility for preserving the cultural heritage of an entire community." As the full scope of her discovery began to sink in, Maya realized that her decision to buy the abandoned brewery had led her to something far more significant than family treasure. She had become the custodian of a piece of American history that had been hidden for nearly a century, waiting for someone with the courage to uncover the truth. But with that realization came a new set of questions and concerns. If these items belonged to other families, how could she find their descendants? And more importantly, if the preservation network had been operating in secret during Prohibition, were there people who would prefer that these secrets remain buried forever? As Maya and Frank carefully resealed the barrel and prepared to explore the others, neither of them noticed the subtle sound of footsteps echoing from the service tunnel Frank had used to enter the brewery. Someone else had discovered that the brewery was no longer empty, and they were very interested in what Maya Rodriguez had uncovered in the darkness.
One more thing, her voice echoed back to them. Don't try to move or sell anything you found until we talk. There are legal implications you don't understand yet, and there are people who would kill to get their hands on what Eduardo preserved. The sound of footsteps faded, leaving Maya and Frank alone in the darkness once again. They waited several more minutes before Frank finally turned his flashlight back on, the beam revealing his worried expression. "Frank," Maya whispered, "who was that? How did she know we were here?" Frank shook his head, looking older and more tired than Maya had ever seen him. "I don't know, but Maya, we need to be very careful from here on out. If Dr. Vasquez found us this easily, others can too. And her warning about people who would kill for these artifacts, I'm afraid she might not be exaggerating." They made their way back to the opened barrel, where they found a business card exactly where Dr. Vasquez had promised. The card was simple but elegant. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Ph.D., Cultural Heritage Recovery Specialist, Institute for Historical Justice, University of New Mexico. There was a phone number and an email address, but no other information. Maya turned the card over in her hands, studying it in the flashlight beam. Institute for Historical Justice? What does that even mean? "It means," Frank said slowly, "that this is bigger than we thought. Maya, I think we need to get out of here for tonight. Take the ledger, take the card, and let's continue this conversation somewhere safer." As they carefully resealed the barrel and gathered their tools, Maya's mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. The discovery of Eduardo's preservation network had been overwhelming enough, but now there were other people involved. People who had been searching for these artifacts for years. People who apparently understood the legal and historical implications better than she did. The walk back through the brewery felt different now, charged with tension and possibility. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound made Maya jump. By the time they reached her truck in the parking lot, she was exhausted, emotionally drained, and more confused than she had ever been in her life. "Frank," Maya said as they stood beside her vehicle, "what do I do now? I bought this place thinking I might find some family heirlooms or maybe a small treasure that would help save the restaurant. Instead, I've discovered what sounds like a major historical find that belongs to dozens of families, and there are apparently people who have been hunting for it for years." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring back at the brewery building. "Maya, your great-grandfather was involved in something remarkable. From what we found tonight, he wasn't just preserving random valuables. He was helping families maintain their cultural identity during one of the most difficult periods in Mexican-American history." He turned to face her directly. "The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? The kind who tries to profit from other people's heritage, or the kind who continues Eduardo's work of preservation and justice?" Maya looked down at the ledger in her hands, thinking about the careful records Eduardo had kept, the families whose precious belongings he had protected, the trust he had earned from people who had lost everything else. "I want to do the right thing," she said finally,
But I don't even know what that means in this situation. I have a responsibility to my own family, too. The restaurant is failing, Mom is worried about losing everything we have left, and David thinks I've already made the biggest mistake of my life. Then maybe, Frank suggested gently, it's time to call Dr. Vasquez. If she's legitimate, she might be able to help you understand your options. And if she's not, well, at least you'll know what you're dealing with. Maya drove home that night with Eduardo's ledger hidden under a blanket in her back seat, and Dr. Vasquez's business card burning a hole in her pocket. Casa Rodriguez was dark when she arrived, but she could see a light on in her mother's bedroom window. Carmen probably was lying awake, worrying about what Maya had gotten them into, wondering if her daughter's obsession with family history was going to destroy their family's future. Maya sat in her truck for a few minutes, staring at the restaurant that had been her family's life for 3 generations. The building was small and tired-looking, with a faded sign and windows that needed new frames. It wasn't much to look at, but it represented everything her grandfather had worked for, everything her family had built in America. How could she balance that responsibility with what she had discovered in the brewery? How could she honor Eduardo's legacy while also protecting her family's immediate needs? She finally went inside and sat at the kitchen table where she had eaten breakfast every morning as a child, where she had done homework while her grandfather cooked dinner, where she had learned to roll tortillas and count money and understand that family businesses require sacrifice from everyone involved. By the light of the old hanging lamp, Maya opened Eduardo's ledger and began to read more carefully. The entries weren't just lists of items and families. They were stories. Stories of people who had fled violence in Mexico, who had arrived in America with nothing but hope and determination, who had entrusted their most precious possessions to a network of strangers because they had no other choice. There was Carmen Delgado, a widow who had carried her late husband's gold watch and their wedding rings across the border, along with a small painting that had belonged to her family for generations. Eduardo had kept detailed notes about where Carmen had settled in California, how to contact her family, and what she hoped to accomplish in America. Page after page revealed similar stories, families torn apart by revolution and persecution, people who had risked everything for the chance at a better life, individuals who had trusted Eduardo Rodriguez to safeguard the tangible reminders of who they had been before they became refugees. As Maya read, she began to understand that the artifacts in the brewery barrels weren't just valuable objects. They were the physical embodiment of hopes and dreams, proof of identities that people had been forced to leave behind, connections to heritage that might otherwise have been lost forever. And Eduardo hadn't just been storing these items randomly. According to his notes, he had been part of a sophisticated network that helped reunite families with their possessions when it was safe to do so. He had maintained correspondence with people across the Southwest, tracking family movements, waiting for the right moment to return precious belongings to their rightful owners. But something had gone wrong. The last entries in the ledger were from early 1933, just before Eduardo disappeared. There were mentions of increased scrutiny and dangerous attention and necessary precautions. The final entry, written in Eduardo's careful handwriting, was brief but ominous. Too many questions from wrong people. Must protect the families and their treasures. Going into hiding until safe. E.R. Maya closed the ledger, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had learned. Eduardo hadn't abandoned his responsibility. He had disappeared to protect it. And now, 90 years later, that responsibility had somehow passed to her. She pulled out Dr. Vasquez's business card and stared at the phone number. Tomorrow, she would have to make a decision that would change everything. She could try to handle this discovery on her own, risking mistakes that might dishonor Eduardo's legacy and endanger the families whose heritage she now protected. Or she could trust a stranger who claimed to understand the historical and legal complexities of what she had found. Either way, Maya realized, her quiet life as a small-town restaurant owner was over. She was now the guardian of secrets that had been preserved for nearly a century, and tomorrow she would have to make a decision of what kind of guardian she wanted to be. Maya didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, Eduardo's ledger open before her, reading story after story of families whose lives had been shattered by violence and upheaval. By the time the sun rose over Millfield, she had made her decision. At exactly 8 a.m., she dialed the number on Dr. Vasquez's business card. The phone rang only twice before a warm, professional voice answered. "Dr. Vasquez speaking." "This is Maya Rodriguez. We need to talk." There was a pause, then what sounded like genuine relief. "Maya, thank you for calling. I know last night must have been overwhelming. Can you meet me this morning? There's a lot you need to understand about what you've discovered." "Where?" asked Maya, surprised by her own directness. "The Millfield Public Library. It's neutral ground, public, and they have a private study room where we can talk without interruption. Can you be there in an hour?" Maya agreed, and spent the next 45 minutes pacing her apartment, rehearsing questions, and trying to prepare herself for whatever Dr. Vasquez was going to tell her. She arrived at the library early, carrying Eduardo's ledger in a backpack, and found Dr. Vasquez already waiting in the small study room. In the daylight, Dr. Elena Vasquez looked nothing like the mysterious figure Maya had imagined from their encounter in the brewery tunnels. She was probably in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a University of New Mexico sweatshirt. She looked like what she claimed to be, an academic, a researcher, someone who spent her time in libraries and archives rather than lurking in abandoned buildings. "Maya," Dr. Vasquez said, standing to shake hands, "I'm sorry about last night. I know my approach was dramatic, but I had to be certain you had actually found Eduardo's cache before I revealed myself." Maya sat down across from her, the backpack containing the ledger on her lap. "How did you know we were there? How did you even know I had bought the brewery?" Dr. Vasquez smiled slightly. "Property transfers are public record. I've had alerts set up for any sales of buildings in this region that match certain criteria. Buildings from the right time period, with the right kind of storage capacity, in areas where the preservation network was known to operate. When the brewery changed hands, I knew I had to investigate." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "But Maya, you need to understand something important. I'm not the only person monitoring property sales in this area. There are others, and their intentions aren't as benign as mine." Maya felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "I mean there are private collectors, black market dealers, and even some organized crime elements who have been searching for the artifacts that disappeared during the Prohibition era. These items aren't just historical significant, many of them are extremely valuable. We're talking about gold, precious gems, artwork, and documents that could be worth millions of dollars on the black market." Dr. Vasquez pulled out a tablet and showed Maya a series of photographs, artifacts similar to what they had found in Eduardo's barrel, but displayed in what looked like private collections.
These items were supposed to be returned to their rightful families or donated to museums, Dr. Vasquez explained. Instead, they ended up in the hands of wealthy collectors who don't care about their cultural significance. Our institute has been working for 20 years to track down preservation network caches and ensure the artifacts are handled properly.
Maya stared at the photographs, recognizing items that looked remarkably similar to what she had discovered. "Your institute, what exactly do you do?" The Institute for Historical Justice was founded to address the cultural theft that occurred during various historical crises. We work with families, museums, and governments to recover and properly preserve artifacts that were displaced during wars, persecution, and social upheaval. The preservation network that your great-grandfather was part of was one of the most sophisticated operations we studied. Dr. Vasquez pulled up more files on her tablet, showing Maya documents and photographs that made her breath catch. There were pictures of Eduardo, much younger than in the family photos Maya had seen, standing with groups of other people in front of buildings she didn't recognize. There were maps showing routes across the Southwest, with the brewery in Millfield marked as one of several key locations. Eduardo Rodriguez wasn't just a participant in this network, Maya. He was one of the leaders. He coordinated operations across 3 states, managed relationships with dozens of families, and developed many of the preservation techniques that kept these artifacts safe for decades. Maya felt a surge of pride mixed with overwhelming responsibility. But he disappeared. The ledger ends in 1933 and then nothing. That's right, and that's where the story gets complicated. Dr. Vasquez closed the tablet and looked directly at Maya. In 1933, the preservation network was compromised. Someone was feeding information to hostile parties, people who wanted to seize the artifacts for profit rather than return them to their rightful owners. Eduardo and several other network leaders went into hiding to protect the operations. She paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. What we've learned from other recovered caches is that Eduardo didn't just disappear randomly. He was murdered, Maya, in 1934 in a small town in Northern California. But before he died, he had managed to hide the location of the most important cache, the one you've just discovered. Maya felt the room spinning around her. Murdered? Who killed him? We believe it was people working for private collectors who wanted to corner the market on these artifacts, the same kind of people who are still operating today, still searching for these caches, still willing to do whatever it takes to get their hands on items worth millions of dollars. Dr. Vasquez reached across the table and touched Maya's hand gently. "This is why I had to approach you carefully last night. I needed to confirm you had found the real cache, but I also needed to make sure you understood the dangers involved." Maya pulled the ledger out of her backpack and placed it on the table between them. "This belonged to Eduardo. I found it in one of the barrels." Dr. Vasquez's eyes widened as she saw the leather-bound book. With Maya's permission, she opened it carefully, her expression growing more amazed with each page she turned. "Maya, this is extraordinary. This ledger contains information we've been trying to reconstruct for decades. The detail, the organization, the care Eduardo took in documenting everything. This is the missing piece that could help us reunite hundreds of artifacts with their rightful families." She looked up at Maya with something approaching reverence. "Do you understand what this means? With this ledger, we can identify the families who entrusted their most precious possessions to Eduardo. We can trace their descendants, verify ownership, and finally return things that have been lost for 90 years. Maya felt a mixture of excitement and terror. "But what about the people you mentioned? The ones who would kill for these artifacts?" "That's where things get tricky," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "Once word gets out that a major cache has been discovered, there will be intense interest from multiple parties, some legitimate, some definitely not. We need to move quickly and carefully." She pulled out a legal document from her briefcase. "This is why I'm here to offer you a partnership with our institute. We can provide legal protection, academic credibility, and, most importantly, security for both you and the artifacts. In exchange, we ask that you work with us to ensure the items are handled according to international standards for cultural heritage recovery." She studied the document, which was filled with legal language she didn't fully understand. "What does this mean for me practically, and what about my family's financial situation?" "It means," Dr. Vasquez said carefully, "that any artifacts that can't be returned to their original families or donated to appropriate museums would be sold through legitimate channels, with the proceeds shared between you and the Institute. We're not asking you to give up your rights as the property owner. We're asking you to be a responsible steward of cultural heritage." She leaned back in her chair. "Maya, based on what I saw last night and what's documented in this ledger, you're looking at a collection that could be worth anywhere from $10 to $50 million.
Even a small percentage of that would be enough to save your family's restaurant and provide financial security for generations. Maya felt dizzy. $10 to $50 million. It was more money than she had ever imagined, enough to solve every financial problem her family had ever faced, but it also represented the hopes and dreams of dozens of families who had trusted Eduardo to protect their heritage. "How long do I have to decide?" Maya asked.
Unfortunately, not very long. Property sales are public record, and there are people who monitor these things very closely. I'd estimate you have maybe a week before word spreads and other interested parties start showing up in Millfield. Dr. Vasquez closed the ledger carefully and slid it back across the table to Maya. "Take this home. Think about what Eduardo would want you to do. Think about the families whose stories are written in these pages, and think about what kind of legacy you want to leave." She stood to go, then paused. "Maya, there's one more thing you should know. The reason I've been searching for Eduardo's cash for 15 years isn't just professional. One of the families whose artifacts Eduardo was protecting was mine. My great-grandmother, Isabella Vasquez, entrusted him with documents and jewelry that proved our family's ownership of land in New Mexico that was later taken illegally." Maya looked up at her, understanding beginning to dawn. "I'm not just here as a researcher, Maya. I'm here as someone whose family trusted Eduardo Rodriguez nearly a century ago. I'm here to finish what our great-grandparents started together." As Dr. Vasquez left the library, Maya sat alone with Eduardo's ledger, realizing that her decision wouldn't just affect her own family's future. It would determine whether 90 years of trust, sacrifice, and hope would finally be honored, or whether Eduardo's legacy would be lost forever to people who saw history as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, and Maya Rodriguez understood that she was about to make the most important decision of her life. Maya drove home from the library in a daze, Dr. Vasquez's words echoing in her mind. $10 to $50 million. Eduardo murdered for protecting these treasures. Other people already searching. The weight of these revelations made her feel like she was carrying the entire history of the Southwest on her shoulders. But when she pulled into the parking lot behind Casa Rodriguez, reality crashed back into her consciousness. Her mother, Carmen, was standing outside the restaurant's back door, holding an eviction notice in her trembling hands. Their landlord, Mr. Peterson, stood beside his expensive SUV, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Maya!" Carmen called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Where have you been? Peterson says we have 30 days to come up with 3 months back rent plus a deposit for next year or we have to close." Maya felt her heart sink as she approached them. Mr. Peterson, a man in his 60s who owned several properties in downtown Millfield, had always been reasonable about late payments before. But looking at his expression now, Maya could see that his patience had finally run out. "I'm sorry, Maya. I know your family has been here a long time, but I can't carry the debt anymore. The restaurant business is tough, and frankly, I have other potential tenants who can pay consistently." Maya looked at the eviction notice, seeing numbers that made her stomach churn. $18,000 in back rent, plus a $12,000 security deposit for the next lease period. $30,000 total. Money they simply didn't have. "Mr. Peterson," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady, "can we work out a payment plan? I may have some options coming up that could help us catch up." Peterson shook his head. "Maya, I've heard that before. Look, I like your family, I really do, but I'm running a business here, not a charity. 30 days is generous under the circumstances." After he drove away, Maya and Carmen stood in the parking lot staring at the restaurant that had been their family's life for 3 generations. The building looked smaller and more fragile than Maya remembered, like a house of cards that could collapse with the slightest breeze. "Maya," Carmen said quietly, "what are we going to do? This restaurant is all we have. It's all your grandfather worked for, all your great-grandfather would have wanted for us in America." Maya thought about Eduardo's ledger hidden in her backpack, about the barrels full of treasures in the brewery, and Dr. Vasquez's offer that could solve all their financial problems. But she also thought about the families whose precious belongings Eduardo had died protecting, about the responsibility that somehow had passed down to her. "Mom, I need to tell you something. It's about the brewery, and about great-grandfather Eduardo." They went inside Casa Rodriguez, closing the door behind them and sitting at the same table where Maya had spent the previous night reading Eduardo's records. Slowly, carefully, Maya told her mother everything. The discovery of the barrels, the artifacts and documents, Dr. Vasquez's explanation about the preservation network, and the staggering value of what she had found. Carmen listened in silence, her expression cycling through disbelief, amazement, and finally, hope. "Maya," she whispered when the story was finished, "are you saying that Eduardo, my grandfather, left us enough to save the restaurant?" "Maybe, but Mom, it's complicated. These aren't just our family's treasures. Eduardo was protecting belongings that belonged to dozens of other families. If we're going to do this right, we need to make sure those families get their heritage back first." Carmen was quiet for a long moment, staring at the eviction notice on the table. "Maya, I understand wanting to honor Eduardo's mission, but we have 30 days to save our family's legacy too. Can't we do both?" Before Maya could answer, the restaurant's front door chimed, and David walked in from his job at the auto parts store. Maya's younger brother took one look at their faces and immediately knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, pulling up a chair. "You both look like someone died." Maya handed him the eviction notice, then launched into the same explanation she had given their mother. David's reactions were more dramatic. He laughed when she first mentioned the barrels, grew skeptical when she described the artifacts, and became very serious when she mentioned the potential value. "Wait," he said, interrupting her description of Dr. Vasquez's offer. "You're telling me that the old brewery I've been making fun of you for buying actually contains millions of dollars worth of treasure, and some academic wants to help you handle it properly?" "That's a simplified version, but yes." David leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "Maya, this is insane! This is like winning the lottery, except better because it's also family history." He paused, looking between Maya and their mother. "What's the catch?" "Because there's always a catch with something this good." Maya explained about the dangerous people who might be interested in the artifacts, about the legal complexities of cultural heritage recovery, and about the moral obligation to return items to their original families when possible. "Okay," David said, "but even if we return 90% of what Eduardo preserved, 10% of $50 million is still $5 million. That's enough to buy this building, renovate the restaurant, open new locations, and set our family up for generations." Carmen nodded slowly. "Maya, your brother has a point. We can honor Eduardo's legacy and save our own family at the same time. Surely Eduardo would have wanted his descendants to benefit from his sacrifices too." Maya felt torn between the immediate need to save Casa Rodriguez and the growing understanding of the responsibility Eduardo had passed down to her. But before she could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Frank Morrison's number. "Maya!" Frank's voice was urgent when she answered. "You need to get to the brewery right now. We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves 3 SUVs with out-of-state plates parked at the brewery and men in expensive suits asking questions about new ownership. How soon can you get here?" Maya felt a chill run down her spine. "We're on our way." She hung up and looked at her mother and brother. Dr. Vasquez was right. Word is getting out faster than we expected. The drive to the brewery felt like the longest 10 minutes of Maya's life. When they arrived, they found exactly what Frank had described. 3 black SUVs parked in the lot, and several men in dark suits examining the exterior of the building. Frank was standing near his own truck, trying to look casual while obviously keeping watch. Maya parked near Frank.
and they all got out together. One of the men in suits immediately approached them, pulling out what looked like a badge or identification. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Maya couldn't place. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain private collectors who are very interested in the historical artifacts that may be present on this property." Maya's heart was pounding, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Rodriguez, we know about the preservation network that operated here during Prohibition. We know about Eduardo Rodriguez and his role in that network. And we know that you've recently gained access to materials that have been hidden for nearly a century." He gestured toward his companions, who were now spreading out around the brewery building. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for exclusive access to any artifacts you may have discovered, more generous than what academic institutions typically offer." Frank stepped closer to Maya, his weathered face showing concern. "Maya, you don't have to talk to these people." Webb's smile became colder. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? The local caretaker. I'd recommend you stay out of matters that don't concern you." Maya felt anger rising in her chest. These were exactly the kind of people Dr. Vasquez had warned her about. People who saw Eduardo's sacrifice and the family's precious belongings as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. "I appreciate your interest," Maya said, her voice getting stronger. "But I'm not ready to discuss any kind of business arrangements yet." Webb studied her for a moment, then nodded to his companions. "That's unfortunate, Ms. Rodriguez. You see, we've been tracking Eduardo Rodriguez's activities for a long time. We know how much those artifacts are worth, and we know how dangerous it can be for amateurs to handle items of such significance." The threat in his voice was subtle, but unmistakable. David moved to stand beside Maya, and she could feel the tension radiating from her brother. "What are you saying exactly?" David asked, his voice tight with anger. "I'm saying that Ms. Rodriguez has stumbled into a situation that's much more complex than she realizes. There are legal issues, international ownership claims, and safety concerns that require professional handling. We're offering to take those complications off her hands." Maya thought about Eduardo's ledger, about the careful records he kept, about the families that trusted him with their precious possessions. She thought about Dr. Vasquez's offer and the Institute for Historical Justice. And she thought about the eviction notice sitting on the table back at Casa Rodriguez. "I need time to consider my options," Maya said. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "Of course. But, Ms. Rodriguez, I should mention that time is a factor here. Word of your discovery is spreading, and there are other parties who may not be as patient or as reasonable as we are."
He handed her the card and gestured to his team. As they walked back toward their SUVs, Webb called over his shoulder, "We'll be in touch very soon, Miss Rodriguez. I hope you'll make the wise choice." As the three black vehicles drove away, Maya, her family, and Frank stood in the brewery parking lot, each lost in their own thoughts about what had just happened. "Maya," Frank said quietly, "those weren't just collectors. Those were people who are used to getting what they want, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it." Carmen was pale but determined. "Maya? Maybe we should take Dr. Vasquez's offer. At least she seems to care about doing the right thing." David was staring after the departing SUVs, his jaw clenched. "Maya, I think we're in over our heads. Whatever Eduardo left behind, it's attracting the wrong kind of attention." Maya pulled out her phone and dialed Dr. Vasquez's number. When the academic answered, Maya didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dr. Vasquez, we need to move faster than we planned. They're already here." Dr. Vasquez arrived in Millfield within 4 hours of Maya's urgent phone call, accompanied by a team that included a legal expert, a security consultant, and 2 graduate students specializing in cultural heritage preservation. They set up a temporary command center in the back room of Casa Rodriguez, transforming the restaurant into an unlikely headquarters for one of the most significant archaeological recoveries in recent history. The good news, Dr. Vasquez explained to Maya and her family as they gathered around tables covered with legal documents and preservation equipment, is that we can move quickly. The Institute has been preparing for this discovery for years. We have legal frameworks in place, secure transportation arranged, and, most importantly, we have a comprehensive database of families who might be connected to these artifacts. She pulled out a tablet showing a map of the southwestern United States, dotted with hundreds of pins representing families who had been part of the preservation network. The challenging news is that Maya was right to be concerned about time. Our sources indicate that at least 3 different private collector groups are converging on Millfield, and none of them are as polite as Marcus Webb. Maya felt a chill at the implication. What does that mean for my family's safety? It means, said the security consultant, a former FBI agent named Sarah Chen, that we need to move the most valuable artifacts to secure locations immediately, and we need to make sure your family has protection until this situation is resolved. Over the next 18 hours, Maya watched as her discovery transformed from a personal family mystery into a coordinated recovery operation that involved lawyers, academics, security experts, and representatives from multiple museums. The brewery became a carefully controlled archaeological site, with each barrel being opened, documented, and catalogued according to international standards. What they found exceeded even Dr. Vasquez's expectations. Eduardo's preservation network had been remarkably sophisticated, with artifacts representing dozens of families and spanning nearly 2 centuries of Mexican and Mexican-American cultural heritage. There were colonial-era silver pieces, Revolutionary War documents, family Bibles with genealogical records, jewelry that had belonged to prominent families, and artwork that museums had considered lost forever. But the most significant discovery came when they opened the largest barrel in the deepest part of the cellar complex. Inside, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth and preserved with meticulous care, Maya found Eduardo's personal collection. Not items he was preserving for other families, but treasures that belonged to the Rodriguez family itself. There were documents proving that Eduardo's father had owned substantial land in Sonora, Mexico, before the Revolution. There were photographs of a prosperous ranch, complete with cattle, horses, and a large hacienda. There were legal deeds, contracts, and correspondence that painted a picture of the Rodriguez family as successful landowners who had lost everything during the political upheavals of the early 1900s. And there, at the bottom of the barrel, Maya found a letter addressed to "My descendants, should they ever seek the truth." In Eduardo's careful handwriting, the letter explained that he had come to America not as a desperate refugee, but as a wealthy man who had liquidated his Mexican assets and converted them into portable wealth, gold, gems, and artwork, with the intention of rebuilding the family fortune in a new country. "I hope," Eduardo had written, "that my descendants will understand that true wealth is not what we possess, but what we preserve for future generations. The families who trusted me with their treasures deserve to have those treasures returned. But the wealth that I accumulated through my own labors, that belongs to the Rodriguez family, to be used for purposes that honor our heritage and help our community." Maya read the letter aloud to her family, her voice breaking with emotion as she realized that Eduardo had not only protected the cultural heritage of dozens of families, but it also ensured that his own descendants would have the resources to continue his work.
Dr. Vasquez calculated that the artifacts belonging specifically to the Rodriguez family were worth approximately $8 million, more than enough to save Casa Rodriguez, purchase the building that housed it, and establish an endowment that would preserve the restaurant for future generations. But Maya's decision about what to do with the discovery went far beyond financial considerations. Working with Dr. Vasquez and the Institute, she chose to establish the Eduardo Rodriguez Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation, housed in the renovated Brewery building. The center would serve as both a museum displaying artifacts that couldn't be returned to their original families and as a research facility dedicated to reuniting displaced cultural treasures with their rightful owners.
The formal opening of the center took place 6 months later, on the anniversary of Eduardo's death. Representatives from dozens of families came to Millfield to reclaim artifacts that had been preserved for nearly a century. Maya watched as elderly women wept over photographs of grandparents they had never met, as men held land deeds that proved their family's rights to property they had thought lost forever, as children traced their fingers over jewelry that connected them to ancestors who had risked everything for the American dream. Carmen Rodriguez, now the proud owner of both Casa Rodriguez and the building that housed it, served traditional Mexican food to the families who had come to reclaim their heritage. The restaurant had been completely renovated and expanded, becoming not just a local eatery, but a cultural center, where people could learn about the history of Mexican immigration to the Pacific Northwest. David had quit his job at the auto parts store and enrolled in a graduate program in museum studies, inspired by his sister's example and determined to continue the family's new mission of cultural preservation. He managed the day-to-day operations of the Eduardo Rodriguez Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation, working with researchers and families from across the Americas to reunite people with their cultural heritage. Frank Morrison, officially hired as the center's historian and archivist, had never been happier. The brewery building had been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility with climate-controlled storage, research laboratories, and public exhibition spaces. The tunnels where Eduardo had hidden his treasures were now part of a guided tour that educated visitors about the history of cultural preservation during times of crisis. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before a display case containing the documents and jewelry that had belonged to her great-grandmother Isabella. The artifacts had been returned to her family, but she had chosen to loan them to the center so that other people could learn about the network of trust and courage that had preserved them. "This is what Eduardo Rodriguez understood," Dr. Vasquez said during her speech at the center's opening ceremony. "Heritage isn't just about objects or money. It's about the connections between past and future, about the trust that families place in each other across generations, and about the responsibility we all have to preserve what matters most." Maya stood at the back of the crowd, watching as people from dozens of families explored the exhibits, learned about their ancestors, and connected with cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost forever. The brewery that had once been a symbol of failed dreams had become a beacon of preserved heritage and renewed hope. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Maya found herself alone in the main exhibition hall, standing before a display that told Eduardo's story. His photograph was mounted next to excerpts from his letters, examples of his meticulous record-keeping, and artifacts that illustrated the scope of his preservation network. She thought about the night she had first descended into the brewery's cellar, carrying only a flashlight and a desperate hope that she might find something to save her family's restaurant. She had found so much more than she had ever imagined, not just treasure, but purpose, not just wealth, but responsibility, not just her family's past, but a mission that would define their future.
The Eduardo Rodriguez Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation became a model for similar facilities across the United States, helping to reunite thousands of families with artifacts and documents that connected them to their ancestors. The work that Eduardo had begun during Prohibition continued into the 21st century, proving that some legacies are too important to be buried by time or circumstance. And Maya Rodriguez, the woman who had once struggled to keep a small restaurant open, became recognized as a leading advocate for cultural heritage preservation, traveling the world to speak about the importance of protecting displaced communities' cultural treasures. But she never forgot that it all began with a desperate decision to buy an abandoned brewery, a willingness to listen to family stories that others dismissed as fantasy, and the courage to honor a responsibility that had been passed down through generations. As Maya locked up the center that first night, she paused to read the inscription that had been placed above the main entrance. Dedicated to Eduardo Rodriguez and all those who understood that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we preserve for those who come after us. She smiled, thinking about her great-grandfather's letter and his belief that the most valuable inheritance we can leave is not money or property, but the knowledge that someone cared enough to preserve what mattered most. Eduardo Rodriguez had trusted that his descendants would understand that responsibility, and Maya had proven him right. The brewery was quiet now, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with stories, with connections, with the ongoing work of preservation and justice. And somewhere in that silence, Maya could almost hear Eduardo's voice, whispering the words that had guided her through her incredible journey. The families who trusted me with their treasures deserved to have those treasures returned. That trust, passed down through 4 generations, had finally been fulfilled. And Maya Rodriguez knew that Eduardo's true treasure, the legacy of cultural preservation and community service, would continue to grow for generations to come. The abandoned brewery was saved, the hidden treasures had been discovered, the family's heritage had been preserved, and Maya had learned that sometimes the most valuable thing we can find is not gold or jewels, but the strength to carry forward the dreams of those who came before us.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.